gonna move on to
Renata
the next. We
Rodrigues.
have Renata
It's about
Rodrigues.
homeopathy and emotional disorders in children during COVID-19 pandemic. So, Dr. Renata.
Boa tarde, estou aqui. Primeiramente, é um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Queria agradecer essa oportunidade. Vou projetar aqui a apresentação.
To share my presentation with you.
Perfeito.
Perfect.
Então, eu peço licença para conduzir a apresentação em inglês.
Ask you permission to make my presentation in English.
A homeopath and pediatrician, and also a member of the Brazilian Association of Recycling and Assistant in Homeopathy, ABRA. And the work that I bring here today is about homeopathy and emotional disorders in children during COVID-19 pandemic. So, this is the group of homeopaths and most of them pediatricians from ABRA that got together to discuss these whole situations that we were seeing our children go through. Okay, so in this contest, what we saw was that the period of social isolation due to the COVID-19 pandemic impact the children's social and family life in different ways. Feelings and emotions experienced by the whole family are intertwined, and everyone is involved in a broad awareness. And the children receive all this with important impact. At the moment, there is a concern regarding behavioral disorders in children and the risk of medicalization. So, the systemic vision of homeopathy can contribute to understand this context. So in this contest, our work had the aim to contextualize the pediatric emotional disorders resulting from the pandemic in the Carrillo Jr.'s view of classic systemic homeopathy, and to list possible homeopathic remedies. For this, we used the follow methodology. So it was 3 different steps. First, we searched for the bibliographic survey about emotional disorders in children during the COVID-19 pandemic. We went through articles, guidelines, everything that was being, talked about around the world. And then we made a theoretical review of the concept of disease in the view of classic systemic homeopathy. So we could understand this situation from the classic systemic homeopathic view. To finally, we get into a selection of drugs based on the method of repertorization of signs and symptoms. And now I'm gonna go through to each one of those steps with more detail. So over here, I bring the bibliographic survey about emotional disorders in children during the pandemic. And so we see articles and guidelines, article from the European Pediatric Association that talked about behavioral and emotional disorders in children during the COVID-19 epidemic. The other one down here that says resilience or resistance, a personal response to COVID-19. And it's this personal response that we want to bring the point here. So after going through all these articles and guidelines, we made a theoretical review of using the classic systemic homeopathy to try to understand this whole situation. And that's what I'm going to bring here by detail. So first, we're going to talk about the concept of health and disease according to the model of the complex systems of Carrillo Jr., which says that health and disease represent different states of instability within the same process. In case our system is in balance of its own functions, it means that it's in the state of health. Otherwise, if this balance is broken, the system is going to be in state of instability. So it's going to be in a state of disease. And it's the self-regulation, the one responsible for maintaining the dynamic balance of the organism, the balance of its physiological functions according to the circumstance in order to preserve the state of health. In a circumstance like the isolation from the COVID-19 pandemic, if the self-regulation fails, the system is going to be in a state of instability that will be manifest through signs and symptoms, which represent the disease. And the disease here, we understand from the emotional and behavior disorders that we saw all the children going through. And once in the state, in the instability state, the system has three paths to follow. The system has to make a decision. He can have a good answer and he can find his own tools to go through that circumstance and learn with it. So he's gonna go for an adaptation, and all that learning and knowledge is gonna be stored in the cognition. So we're gonna have a cognitive gain, which is the way that we want to happen. That's the decision that we want the system to make. Another possibility is injury. If the system isn't able to keep its balance, if the self-regulation fails, we're going to have impact in the system, which we understand here as the sign of and symptoms that the children showed, the mental and behavioral disorders. And the last one is death, which we don't want to happen. Okay, so we went through the concept of health and disease according to the systemic view of homeopathy, and to talk about more what we saw and what we used to understand the situation of the children, we have to explain a little bit more about the model of the complex systems of Carrillo. So the model of the complex systems of Carrillo is composed by 8 elements, but over here, I'm going to talk about 5 of them to explain it, which are dissipation, consciousness, self-regulation, cognition, and adaptation. So starting from self-regulation, self-regulation is the ability of all living beings to keep their internal constants in constant variation according to the circumstance in order to conserve the state of health. When this property becomes deficient, if the self-regulation fails, it says that the individual is sick. And the homeopathic remedy is going to work, is going to act in the self-regulation, more specific in the action result receivers, creating a disease, an artificial disease similar to the natural one, to stimulate the system to make its own moves, to find or to build its own tools, to respond from that situation, trying to keep its state of balance. Another element that we bring here is the dissipative process. When something intense and unexpected happens, like the social isolation from the COVID-19 pandemic, that is going to work as an external input. Some of us, most of us, got scared from it. And this external input, if it crosses the selective barrier, it gets into the system. And the system has to make a decision which way he's gonna, what he's gonna do with that input. So this external input is gonna be processed, and it can be eliminated from the system without causing any damage. Another possibility is that the system will assimilate it, will make its own moves and create or build new tools to learn with that circumstance. And all of this learning and knowledge, all of this gain is going to be stored in cognition. And the other possibility is that this external input will be processed and become an internal input, like fear that many kids had from all of it. And this internal input, probably because of the maturity of the children, you know, they don't have this processing capacity is still developed as us adults. So this internal input is going to be circulating in the system, causing damage to the system, which the system will manifest through signs and symptoms. And we understand those signs and symptoms here as the emotional and behavioral disorders. Another two elements, adaptation and cognition. Adaptation is the ability to learn from situations experienced throughout life. All of this learning is stored at the level of cognition. And cognition is the ability to modify, build, and incorporate action programs. And action programs is how we call the learnings in the complex systems of Carrillo. So from this, we understand that the child has less cognition than the adult because they have been going through less experience in adults. So they don't have so many knowledge stored in their cognition. So it's going to be harder for them to face, you know, acute and unexpected circumstance like this one. Another element, I'm sorry, consciousness. I bring here, we have three plans of consciousness: rational, intuitive, and sensitive. Rational, it's developed throughout life based on the acquired knowledge, modulated by metacognition, and it prevails in adult because, as we said, adults have been going through more experience in life. So all those learnings are stored in their cognition. Intuitive, it prevails in the baby. It's responsible for bringing inborn knowledge, then written knowledge, and also for capturing subliminal inputs from the surrounding environment. And here I bring another concept, the concept of broad consciousness. We in the family, each member in the family has its own individual consciousness, but sharing the same psychosphere, emotions and feelings all mixed up in the same psychosphere, in the same broad consciousness. Sensitive, as the baby grows, sensitive consciousness develops and is very present during childhood. That's why they experience the world around them through the sense. So resuming, what's important here in our subject is that kids has less rational consciousness than adults. So it's hard for them to respond. They still don't have so many tools developed in their system to take the right decision. And on the other hand, they have the intuitive consciousness more amplified, so they capture lots of that subliminal inputs. To illustrate that, I bring here this slide, and we see COVID-19 pandemic and social isolation as the important, as the acute and unexpected circumstance that caught us unexpectedly, and we had to stay isolated at home. Each one of us with our individual consciousness responding in different ways. Some of us with anger, fear, sadness, anxiety, but sharing the same psychosphere, sharing the same broad consciousness, and the children in the middle of it with their intuitive consciousness amplified, capturing of those emotions and feelings that act as the external input. And it gets into their system, and then with their immaturity, having lots of problems to deal and to learn and to have the right response for this. So in front of this instability, the circumstance, how are the children going to respond? It will depend. It will depend on some elements of the system that we went through before, like self-regulation, dissipative process, adaptation, and cognition. In case the children, if the self-regulation works, and the system can make its own moves, find its own tools to respond. If the kids are able to process that input and maybe eliminate it and learn with that situation, so get adaptation, and all this learning be stored in their cognition, they will respond with resilience and they're gonna have cognitive gain. In otherwise, in case the self-regulation fails, like we talked before, and because of maybe from a immaturity from the system, you know, it's they're not able, the selective barrier is really low, and all of those external inputs getting into their system and they're not being able to process and eliminate it, they will respond to this instability with vulnerability. And the system will manifest this vulnerability with signs and symptoms, which we understand from the emotional and behavior disorders that we saw our children going through. So now I bring here our result and our discussion after going through this whole theoretical things. So first, after searching the articles and guidelines, what we saw is as the main emotion and behavioral disorders are distraction, fear, anxiety, agitation, irritability, poor sleep, and nightmares. So we saw lots of impact in sleep and also in the emotional and mental disorders. That's what the articles and guidelines said. So after seeing all this, we had to understand, why are those kids reacting like this? Why are they responding like this? So we went through the model of the complex systems of Carrillo, and through this, we can understand what is being received by children as subliminal inputs, since they do not undergo an assessment of the rational consciousness. As we said, they have their intuitive consciousness amplified, so they capture lots of subliminal inputs without being aware of it. Individual resilience and vulnerability will determine how they respond, and it will depend especially of the self-regulation. It will depend of that different elements from the system, of the movements that the system is going to make, but especially from the self-regulation. In case of vulnerability, emotional and behavioral disorders can occur. Using the systemic view of homeopathy to understand the acute disorders found in this isolation period, the social isolation period, we select possible remedies after the hepatorization method, like belladonna, chamomila, aconitum napellus, argentum nitricum, gelsemium, tarantula hispanica, stramonium, Ignatia Mara, Aurum Metallicum, Cypripedium, and Coffea cruda. These two last ones covering the sleep disorders, and the other ones covering all of those emotional disorders like irritability, anxiety, and it will be decided specific for each patient according to the specific symptoms and signs that we would capture. Okay, so bringing here the conclusion that we took from this is that the imposed social isolation leads to an excess of external inputs on the pediatric population, and the difficulty in processing them can lead to the emergence of emotional disorders. The scientific articles that have been held during this isolation period made only recommendation in an attempt to minimize the impact of social isolation on children's mental health. And allopathic drugs for this purpose have a very limited indication, and several side effects of that are potentially harmful to the body. So, therefore, homeopathy as a cognitive therapy that acts on the self-regulation of the organism, that acts stimulating the system to make its own moves and to keep its balance or to return its state of balance, is an excellent, beneficial, and assertive tool. So thank you all for this opportunity. I want to thank especially my friends and my partners from Mabra and for the opportunity to share this study, and for my master, Romeu Carillo Jr., that brought us the complex system of Carillo and helped us a lot to understand these sad emotional disorders and those impact that the social isolation causing in our children. Thank you. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Renata. Very beautiful presentation.
Sim.
Up to
Thank
this
you.
moment, you have no questions
Okay.
in the Q&A window. Maybe maybe you could go to the next one, and even if there is some question, we can do it all together at the final.
Of course. Of course. Thank you, Leonie.
Thank you.